As we got ready for the jump and the subsequent battle, everyone hit the decks running and got exactly to their stations. Everything was primed and ready as we got ready for the jump. I sent the call out 5, 4, 3, and with that I noticed even my command crew was strapping in as we knew this was going to bump us a little bit. As we jumped, we ended up in the next sector and there was nothing. There was no battle. And then I had to check the areas again. What in the hell is going on? Checking the star map to see where the distress calls were coming from. Crap, there are at least 2 more sectors out. And we need to recharge the engines. Oh, son of a, 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 son. Yeah! The waiting is the worst part because you know the battle is commencing. You know seconds and minutes count. You gotta go. I tried to flush the coolant as best I could to try and reset the engine so that we could jump again. This saved us some time, actually saved us a lot of time. I really give props to the engineers as they told me this was going to work, but it would only happen once or twice. After that, the engine would need time to recover. We got ready after a few minutes to jump again, and I gave the countdown. 5, 4, 3. Clenching down on the command couch, I closed my eyes, making sure I'm locked into the system, and off we went. And this time, on the second planet in the sector, we could see the battle commencing. We went full burn, at least what you can with a gravimetric drive, straight towards their planet, keeping just below FTL speed. We knew it would take a couple hours to get there. I kept getting word from my fighters, requesting permission to launch and get there before we did. I kept denying that because I knew if they ran in just guns blazing but didn't have a plan, they had a even higher chance of getting hit by their own people. So I held them off for about a half an hour until we got closer. As we got past another planet's orbit, I gave the permission to launch, but not until I released the drones. The AI almost seemed happy with this, as the drones spilled out like a bunch of angry wasps, and right behind them the cargo bays opened and every single one of our fighters launched in quick succession. They began to burn as fast as they could straight towards the battle. I pinged towards the command ship and I let them know that we're coming. Unfortunately, pinging their ship allowed the enemy to notice us. They noticed this big, bulbous bastard in the sky and they thought, hey, there's an easy target. Not realizing that we were surrounded by all sorts of weapons and a lot of fighters. They tried to jump in close again, but this time we were ready for their BS, as everything had been primed. The moment they jumped out of FTL, they found themselves under increasingly heavy fire. The point defense systems would fire as best they could, but if the ship was far enough away, they might just as well miss, even with energy weapons. However, the missiles, they don't miss. Unless you shoot them down, they track and they kill you. It took about 28 seconds before the missiles actually struck their target. In that amount of time, I'm sure each of them was probably saying, oh crap, we picked the wrong target. Especially since I made sure there was at least twice as many missiles firing as required to take out each individual ship, which meant each fighter actually had 2 chasing it. And once it lost its target, i.e. it got hit, it would immediately lock on to the next enemy unit. I contacted my fighter squadron and told them to not worry about the Godfather ship, but instead help out the main body. Head towards the fleet at maximum speed, get there as soon as possible, and lay waste to every single one of them. I knew the pilots. I trained them. And I gave a silent prayer as I prayed that we would get them back. But the fight above that planet was a massive furball. These new aliens had figured out that they needed to get close, very close, to give maximum damage to our ships. Even though their ships weren't nearly as rugged as ours, they were hitting us with numbers. A lot of numbers. Their mass drivers were coming in at point-blank range, close enough that our point defense systems were able to chew on their ships even before they fired. The mass drivers would fire, but before they had a chance to even reload it, that ship would be tore up. The problem is, the ordnance was already on its way. Any human ship tried to use their own missiles to try and deflect these mass driver rounds, or at least mass driver is what we called them. I have no idea what the actual name is, nor do I care at this point. All I know is this ship is taking random hits left and right. We're getting outer hull breaches, small ones, but it's enough to be concerning. If it's tearing this ship up with just that amount of force, oh boy, I do not want to be in the middle of that furball. The AI, thankfully, is doubling up with all our folks on their turrets, and they are just laying into everything around. Enemy fighters that come in are very quickly dispatched before they even fire a shot. I believe they started to understand what was going on when a few of them jumped in from FTL and then immediately turned away, trying to spin up their FTL engines again. We didn't give them a chance. In more than one occasion, our missiles found their way directly into the engine compartment of each of these ships, causing a cascading explosion that went from its ass to its face and blew it to hell apart. It was like the world's largest fireworks display whenever that happened, as each compartment would explode individually as it rippled its way up through the ship. I didn't have any main guns. At this point, I was wishing that I did, as we were getting close enough to the main fleet where main guns would have actually come in handy. The best I could do was I locked onto the enemy flagship and began to fire volley after volley of torpedoes. My helmsman began to move us left, right, and center enough that it began to actually hurt me with the amount of G-forces she was beginning to pull. Our tactical officer was also going absolutely crazy trying to track everything that was going on. He was extremely good at his job, but he required the AI to help him out a lot. There was just so much going on. And as we began to bulwark our way right through the enemy fleet, I fired every piece of ordnance I could get my grubby little mitts on, and out it went. This was when the enemy realized that this large, bulbous ship was not exactly unarmed and wouldn't be an easy target. So they turned their weapons on us, which was a major mistake. Without constant fire, the dreadnoughts and battleships were able to lock on their targets a whole lot easier and begin to fire full-on broadsides right into the enemy fleet. Some of them were finally coming from the far side of the planet and the far side of the satellites or their moons and firing into the enemy fleet. The enemies began to tear themselves apart from debris fields as they began to explode in all directions. The enemy, facing our combined fleet, attempted to run but didn't realize the interdiction fields that were put off by large ships like the Godfather, the battleships, the dreadnoughts, or even a simple space station was enough to stop their FTLs from fully activating, and it was wonderful to watch them try to drift away, firing their aft weapons, which were not nearly as strong as their bow-mounted weapons. Oh, it was a slaughter after that, and a true turkey shoot. And as the battle died down, I began to recall all my fighters, manned and unmanned alike, and I got count. We had lost 18% of our unmanned fighters and 6% of our manned fighters. The reason why the loss on the drones so much is that they were much, much faster and in the fray much more than any type of manned fighter, since there wasn't much to them. Unfortunately, because of that, when they're hit, any hit will mainly send them tumbling towards the nearest gravity well. It is unbelievably crazy how frail these drones actually are. No matter how much I tried to arm them, the AI kept fighting this, as it said its speed and maneuverability was its greatest asset. Okay, if you say so. Once everyone was on board, I cleared with the command. They kept their own forces close, but if it wasn't for the locals, we would have simply left that planet. Approximately a quarter of what was left of the human forces jumped to the next sector. I jumped with them this time, as I was not waiting behind in a second, third, fourth, or fifth line. That wasn't going to happen. My crew was already reloading their fighters, and my torpedoes and missile tubes were already recycled, reloaded, and my jump engines had finally cooled and spooled up. We were ready to rock and roll, and into the next sector we went, and it was the same as before. Everything was on fire. Everything for several different planets was tearing itself apart, and we, like a bulldozer through a soft piece of dirt, started blowing through the enemy fleet. They saw us jump in, and many, if they were smart, turned and ran. But as they did, their own ships actually fired on them, which, hey, if they want to take out their own, that's less work for us. Didn't know, didn't care, but in just a few moments of coming out of our jump, we started launching torpedoes in mass volleys. Every single ship capable of firing torpedoes at that point, everything from a frigate all the way up to my colony ship, fired into the enemy fleet. It would take over a minute before the torpedoes actually struck their target, so we only prayed that the losses to our side would not be as bad before the torpedoes hit. And as the torpedoes came in, you could see many of the main guns of the enemy fleets turn and begin to fire at the torpedoes in a vain attempt to knock them away or destroy them. Only a handful of torpedoes were actually struck and destroyed, as torpedoes were armored specifically for this reason. And they struck into the enemy fleet, again burying themselves deep as they penetrated as hard as they could. No warning, just deep inside, and then burst out as hard as possible, most likely cracking them in half. Thinking of it now, that's a very fun double entendre. At the time, all I cared about was taking out with the next volley of torpedoes. Just as the next volley went out, we launched all our fighters, with orders to protect the remaining vessels around the planets. That was their orders, not to directly engage the enemy fleet, but to get their fighters away from our ships. The enemy had learned a little bit of stealth tech, which allowed their fighters to actually be fighter craft in space, which until that point was an insane idea. The idea without stealth to actually get close to any type of enemy ship and being able to take it by force was a ridiculous idea, as everyone would see you coming minutes, sometimes a half an hour or better away through their sensors. But now, since all these fighters are stealth rigged, it got very nasty very quick. With that, we saw another wave of the enemy ships get penetrated and explode. We were getting within effective missile range now, but we couldn't fire anything like that as we saw our fighters crossing inside the line. We warned them not to do this and go all the way around, but they didn't want to listen. They simply wanted to get into the fray as much as possible. They were tearing up our friends now. We were at the Zell's home planet, and these were our friends. The Zell fleet was mixed in with ours, and they were fighting tooth and nail to protect their planet. Their satellites were doing what they were supposed to do, but much of the satellite network had already been either disabled or destroyed. These guys had played it smart, very smart. When they jumped in, the first thing they did was fire a volley into the satellite network. They jumped in really close to the planet, and with anything larger as far as ships go, would have been devastating for them, as the gravity well would have yanked them with such force it would have killed everyone inside. But as they took out a large section of the satellites, they had no idea where the combined fleets were, which made it difficult for them. And by the time they had got a beat on them, our own folks had realized that they were under assault and already started firing. It was simply a slugfest from that point on. It was absolute chaos as we got within range. Again, the enemy fleet tried to jump in close to use their mass driver cannons on us. These mass drivers took out a few frigates. At least one destroyer that I saw was disabled and started to drift. At least they got the engine. But they didn't get the guns, and the guns kept firing because we're just going to give them a good old human fuck you. With that, several of my fighters had peeled off to protect the disabled ships, and I sent recovery vessels out to get any crew that needed recovery off their ship. I did see one frigate that went adrift and then simply exploded as its drive went critical. It imploded and then exploded. It's a good thing I'm using just sensors, because if I was looking at that, it would have cooked my retinas completely. It seemed to have that type of effect on a few of the ships, as many of the alien fighters, at least those that were manned, started to drift off to the side. I don't know if it was the EMP. I don't know if it was the flash. I don't know. I don't care. All I know is it made them easy targets for our point defense systems. And our turrets simply spun around and started whipping all sorts of hell to the enemy. Again, we just rushed in. This time, the enemy would be facing us on several different fronts, as both groups were coming around both sides of the planet on the equator, and we came from the southern hemisphere. Not only were they having trouble trying to keep themselves from getting in a pincer movement, but now, since you're in three-dimensional space, things get a lot more interesting. As we allowed our ships to drift their way across, we altered course so that I could keep the main shielded portion of the ship in line with the enemy, just in case we took a hit, and which we did. Several strikes came in, and we could hear them refracting off the hull. I designed that front specifically for this reason. Unfortunately, it hit with enough force that one of my torpedo tubes was taken out of action. I sent the recovery drones in to try and get as much done as possible, but there's only so much they can do in a short amount of time. Taking a quick peek at the internal cameras, I could see the drones scurrying their way inside to fix the launcher and to make sure that the torpedoes did not explode inside this ship. That would be bad. Even though the ship was designed specifically so the magazines would blow out and not in, it didn't matter. It would still leave a gaping hole in this ship and leave us adrift at least for a few hours. I didn't want that, and neither did anyone else. A few more rounds struck off the front of the hull as it brought me back to the battle. Several of the other torpedo tubes had rearmed, and I began to fire another volley into their larger ships. At this point, they must have realized they were screwed, as they began to try and kamikaze our ships. Their own debris field was causing them major problems. Our fighters were able to whip around these debris fields and actually make sure that using the debris in the way, the point defense systems didn't blow them in half, allowing them to fire again and again and again into the enemy ships. But now we had a bigger problem. As their fleet spun up their FTL engines, we realized that's not going to work, but that's not what they were doing. They were using excess power in their FTL engines to overpower their engines. They were going to smash into ours as a great last act of defiance. I'm like, well, these guys are a little more human than we give them credit for. Well, we ain't going to let you do that. Out of sheer desperation, the call went out from one of the destroyers as he screamed, "They're gonna ram us!" Oh no, they're not. With that, we began to fire with reckless abandonment. Number of torpedoes be damned that we have left over. It doesn't matter. We're not letting them work. Unfortunately, we did see several of their ships spin up and immediately launch towards ours. Though they were taken down beforehand, space is still space, inertia is still inertia, and it's all a real pain in the ass, as the main body of their ship would still be drifting towards our own battle groups. Our people try to get out of the way the best they can, but it's what happens in space combat. There is so much, and several of the ships were taking out just from impact from debris. In a few cases, you could see parts of the ships embedded into our own. Even a Zell cruiser was sitting there and had several pieces of whatever that was, I think it was a frigate, stuck into its dorsal section. That was the weirdest looking ship I ever seen. One engine on the front, one engine on the... Is it in the front? Whatever. But whatever, the engine in the back wasn't the one pushing as hard, and it went a little flying, at least until the engines cut out, and they were able to rewrite themselves. I sent several more fighters to the surface, and I could hear our commander of the wing start sending out, "Prepare for atmospheric flight." In other words, strap in. You're not in 0G anymore. Things don't maneuver the same way, because now you have an atmosphere to deal with. As they went down, I tried to get a good look at what was going on. Unfortunately, I didn't have any weapons that could help except for a couple of missiles, which would barely reach the surface if I tried. Thankfully, the Zells had been ready for this invasion, and they were ripping all sorts of wholesale ass. I smiled as I tried to ping in, and I found Junior and the family. They were still in their homestead, and as I looked in real close, I could see dozens of slave master bodies strewn all over the place. Though it was a bad idea to use static defenses, you don't go on a farmer's land without their permission. This is a universal truth. While waiting for the last of the enemy to be mopped up, I received a signal from another group coming into the sector. For a moment, I freaked out like crap, now who do we gotta fight this time? But thankfully, I got a word. It was the Martian reinforcements that had finally decided to show up. We told them that this sector was clear and they just needed to move on, which they did after they let their engines cool. I asked them, "Where's the Venetian fleet? Shouldn't they be hot on your heels?" The response was simple. "They went to a different sector, sir." All I could think was, okay, well, there's a fight everywhere. At least they're getting into it. At this point, I was just hoping that they didn't send their whole fleet, because God help us if the enemy finds the way to the Soul sector. Granted, the Soul sector is kind of protected in a way that every sector or two in every direction has been liberated, which means the enemy would have to fight their way through or attempt to do an FTL jump on the way by, which would very much let us know that they're coming. We would have a couple hours at their FTL speed to actually be able to get everything ready, and we would even know basically which direction they're coming from. I think they kind of learned that lesson, not to screw with us in our own sector, but it's a pretty safe bet they didn't expect us to come whole hog and come protect our friends. I checked the comms traffic. As it turns out, the Chitters were putting up a hell of a fight. Though taking a lot of damage and a lot of casualties, their home planet was pretty safe, except for the occasional debris that fell down. That being said, I kind of felt bad as I noticed that in the casualty reports were all the Chitters that I had known, minus the Queen that I had met. It was unfortunate, but with a battle that large, as the enemy had gone at them with at least 5 times the amount of ships that were facing the Zell's home planet, I guess they realized that the Chitters were far more dangerous. Which in a sense is true, as they can produce out far more material and personnel than any other species. At least, species that I know of. After the Martian battle group moved on, and our folks had cleared the planet, I simply sent a message down to Junior and the family. I simply told them how their guardian angels would be back. And I want to see the grandkids soon when I get there, okay? I'm sure they received the message, as it was pinged that they received. Eventually, I was able to get the rest of the drones and the fighters back on board along with the recovery craft. We had to move on. We didn't have time to wait. This time when we jumped, the battle was already over when we got there. The Martians had really ripped into the enemy. I mean, seriously, yikes. I started to wonder what the hell was in those cannons, but didn't really have time to worry about it. I simply asked them if they required assistance. They said negative. "Roger, as soon as my engines are cool, I'm heading to the next sector," which was the farthest one out that we had knowledge of in this direction. As we got ready to jump, the Martian fleet, along with several from the planet we had just saved, got into the fray. They demanded that I wait in second line, considering my ship does not have any large main guns. I told them my torpedo tubes are fixed. I can really lay waste to everybody. They still insisted that I wait until at least second line. So I did. The waiting is horrible. I saw the entire fleet begin to blink out as their jump engines came online and they went to the next sector. I knew this sector was going to be a hard fight because this was the very far edge. If they hadn't taken the sector completely, then, oh crap, it's still going to be a massive firefight. I was right, unfortunately. When I jumped in, all the ships had already begun to engage. All the turrets had actually got within range and started trying to pick each other off. Several of the enemy ships, this time massive ships, had come into play. This was a veteran sector. The veterans, though they might not be strong or, well, built very well, as they're very, very skinny and very, very frail, they tend to be also very good friends with the demonoids. So much so that they formed a kind of kinship. It's strange, but I think it has something to do with the fact that both species were enslaved almost exclusively for their appearance, their aesthetics, their beauty, and because of that, they were both treated poorly the same way. The thought about this, the fact that they had sent large ships, I knew what this meant. It meant they didn't want to just take the planet. They wanted to take the personnel. These were not just battleships. These were like mine. These were colony ships. These things were giant cargo vessels designed to take personnel somewhere. I've only seen this style of ship one other time, and that is when they first showed up on Earth, and fuck you. No way. No more. No more. This is not ever happening again. It was almost palpable as the tension and the rage of everyone who saw these ships. We all knew what it meant. The demonoids couldn't understand why, as of humans, we went from very talkative to suddenly extremely quiet and focused. I simply stated, I'm about to let you loose. When we get within range, I want you to do one thing and one thing only. Kill them all! And with that, I could see lights pinging, letting everybody know that they were ready to rock and roll, ready to launch. I wanted to get a little closer, as I knew our fighters were going to need to get around the volley of torpedoes that were coming out. I called the command of the Martian fleet and told them I would be taking up my position. He gave me a different position to lock into, but I realized that it was actually a better firing position than when I had originally thought. Coming from almost their complete northern pole, we had a very good line of sight on the fleet as they tried to circle around the equator of this planet. They had already taken down every single one of the defense satellites, all of them, which was incredible in its own right. However, we could see that much of their fleet had taken extreme amounts of damage. They were still trying to wrestle with what was left of a battle group just outside one of this planet's 2 moons. It was kind of difficult, as what was left was a bunch of really talented destroyers. I say this because you could actually see them dancing between shots. The mass drivers may be good, but they're still ballistic weapons and they still take time to get there. Our destroyers' main guns were able to put to rest any issues with ships trying to get close. However, it would only be time before they would eventually be taken apart piecemeal, as sometimes it's not about quality but quantity in a battle, and we could see that they were slowly getting overrun. The enemy noticed us and began to turn most of their main guns towards us, but it was too late. We got the word from the Martian admiral, "Ready all forward batteries. Open fire!" And with that, the night sky simply caught fire itself. Every one of our turrets, whether it be energy or ballistic, every torpedo launcher fired, and with that all the bays opened, and like an army of angry flying monkeys soaked in amphetamines, every single one of the drones came out, and right behind them the manned fighter crafts were launched, and they all swarmed down, making sure they stayed out of the way of the main guns. It was like a giant flower that what they could see, the main body surrounding their battleships and any carriers they had towards the center. As they went out, destroyers, frigates, colony ships like myself, and then as the fighters went, they blossomed out towards the side and then turned and headed straight towards them, making sure there was a large gap, large enough that each of the torpedoes, missiles, mass drivers, energy weapons, and anything else was going to lay waste to these bastards. We thought for sure this was going to be just another quick victory, but no, their ships were strong enough to take several of our hits. The mass driver cannons in many cases would ricochet off the hull, as the hulls had a strange angled roundish shape to them. It was odd. There was no type of energy weapons, if anybody thought about that, but the energy seemed to dissipate just enough as our weapons were not able to focus enough at that range. This is why we were trying to close as fast as we could to make sure that we could get enough fire on them. Thankfully, the torpedoes did do a lot of damage, especially to the smaller ships, as again, they penetrated as deep as possible, not even given the courtesy of a reach. Never mind, I won't finish that. But they did blow up inside them. It was glorious to watch these small ships go, and eventually we had several fighters trying to fight their way through, straight through our fire and their own ships to try and get to us. With that, our point defense systems and our missile batteries began to open up on them, and it was again just a wave of explosions as debris came towards the ship. You could hear the clanging of metal on metal as these pieces fell against our ships. But now their big ships wanted to play, and they brought a massive array of weapons. I saw several fighters, frigates, destroyers, corvettes were the easiest ones to take out. Even one of our battleships had taken a direct hit and went adrift. I didn't see its turrets firing after that, but I didn't see any damage to the engine, which tells me that they were siphoning it off to make sure that the life support system was still functioning. I didn't see any escape pods either, and I was hoping that I wouldn't see it explode. With that, my own ship took another large hit. It refracted slightly, but the inner and outer hull had been ruptured. I called in damage control teams as fast as I could, and the drones immediately went towards it, doing what they could to heal everything, but they only could work so fast. More rounds began to fly in. My point defense systems were firing as best they could and beginning to run absolutely hot as balls, trying to keep that much ordnance from striking. But there's only so much, as more and more ordnance kept firing from both sides. The battleships and dreadnoughts began to use flak batteries as a way to stop the incoming ordnance. Unfortunately, it would damage our own on the way there, which meant that there was a line in between each of the fleets, theirs and ours, that was simply burning. And as we got close, the fleet admiral told me to hold along with several others and to focus on repair, recovery, and medical. I immediately told my crew to get all the recovery vehicles ready and to be ready to receive any type of wounded personnel. We had already taken on a bunch, but we knew this was going to be bad. This was going to be really, really bad. And it was, as many of the escape pods and several shuttles started aiming for our cargo bays. As soon as they were inside, we would shut the cargo bay and repressurize within a matter of seconds, just so that we could get them out of their shuttles and into the medical facilities as soon as we could. It was an absolute madhouse down there, and I wanted to do what I could, but I had to stay in the command couch and control this freaking ship. The AI did at one point offer to take over, but I looked at it and said, "You're a bit too reckless still. You need a calmer head, and you don't have nearly the experience." It seemed to take offense, but with that simple female mechanical voice I gave it, "Affirmative, Captain," was all it got. I could see through the video as several of the wounded were coming on, missing parts, bleeding all over the floor. In some cases, they were brought out and immediately scanned, and there was nothing anyone could do. I'm sorry, but if your brain is quite literally blown out of your head, I don't care how good our medical tech is, there's nothing we can do there. Especially when you're missing half of your chest as well. Things were absolutely gruesome. The demonoids did everything they could to make sure everybody was fixed up as fast as possible. Most of it was what we used to call meatball surgery, as they simply patched everybody up enough where they would stay alive and get the next person and patch them up just enough to stay alive and told, "We'll get you later. We'll fix the rest of you later, but we can't do that now. We got more waiting." A few good soldiers actually stood there and more than one case would pass out from blood loss as they ushered more of their own in to get them fixed up, even though they were hurt even more. I had to tell the demonoids that this would happen, as this was something a good leader does. It wouldn't matter if you're bleeding profusely. If your men are hurt, they get medical treatment first. The battle outside was just as gruesome, as we could see bodies beginning to fill the atmosphere as things started to burn up from falling into the planet's gravity well. We were only in one planet, and there was two in this sector that needed to be taken care of. The other one was still fighting. We could see it on our sensors, but we didn't have anything that we could send. We had to clear the space around this planet first before we could move on. And thankfully, that large container ship tried to turn and get away from the planet. We waited till it got clear of the gravity well as it tried to spin up its FTL engines. And the commander simply stated, "Take that thing out of our sky." I locked on every torpedo tube that I had ready to fire and fired as well as everyone else. The cannons, the lasers, the torpedoes, the missiles, it didn't matter. They all ended up into this bulbous ship. Unfortunately, there was more than one, and they still fought. But the battle would be over soon. They must have known that they were in trouble. They must have known that they didn't have a chance against us, and they knew they couldn't run. So one of these ships decided the only safe place to be would be on the planet. We watched in horror as this massive ship began to break into the atmosphere. It was still strong enough that it could fight, but for some reason they wanted to land. We all knew what was going to happen. There is not a single anti-grav system anywhere that is strong enough to stop something that big from going splat on the planet's surface. It was no surprise that they ended up sliding several kilometers across the surface as they tried to belly land, most likely stripping off the bottom decks of their ship. But eventually it did come to a halt. With that, it was time to get some boots on the ground. I looked over to the destroyers and the frigates, and they started launching pods, massive amounts of pods, and all sorts of landing craft started heading towards the surface of the planet. All I could think of was, as much as you pissed us off, we're going to teach you never to underestimate the fury of the patient man, because that's what we were. At that point, only a few ships remained to give some sort of support to those on the ground. The rest of the battleships and dreadnoughts immediately turned to the other planet and did as best they could to get there as soon as possible, as the battle still raged. I, however, was stuck on this planet, could only watch in sensors as they, with reckless abandon, jumped in right next to the planet, which was really crazy, and began to fire all sorts of madness. I only could imagine what was going through their mind, as even through the sensors I could see from this distance, their weapons were glowing hot. Those cannons, after this battle, would have to be replaced. There's no way they'd be salvageable after that. But it didn't matter. The guns still spun and fired at anything they could. I could only imagine how much ordnance they were actually going through in their point defense cannons, as many of these were older ships and still used ballistic point defense guns. My point defense guns were having trouble being reloaded, as we needed the fabricators to run full steam just to make enough ordnance to refill them. But I didn't have any other vessels to deal with. I was so happy at that point that many of the fighters, unfortunately not all, but many, most actually, were redocking inside the ship. And as they did, without question, without orders, they got out of their fighters and ran straight towards the medical bays and started patching everyone up. It was something about our demonoids that seemed to calm the humans down. Many of them were thrashing like crazy from the pain as their crewmates would bring them towards the medical facility straight into the aid station. Yet seeing our pretty demonoids was enough to calm them down, just enough that we could work on them. Our system worked full bore for the next 8 days, nonstop, Human days, that is. It took that long before the planet began to calm down. 8 days. The soldiers on the ground must have been running on I don't know what medication because they didn't stop. I know we are persistence hunters, which I'm sure scares the living crap out of the enemy. But now they saw that sometimes we just won't stop. Not that we can't, but we won't. Looking at the other planet, the battle had been over for a long time. However, this was the Veterans' home planet, and they did defend it. They defended it very well. Maybe it was because we had given them a whole bunch of weapons and intel and everything else, but this was something they were not going to give up easy. More of our own soldiers did hit the ground over there, but they were having a much easier time. We don't know what it was about the planet I was right on top of that they wanted to take so badly. Maybe it was the fact that there wasn't as much defenses and they thought they could get as many prisoners without having to deal with as much casualties. It didn't matter. At that point, I was mentally exhausted as I had not unplugged since we started. It had been almost 2 weeks. Try staying awake for that long and having to focus on your work like that of a surgeon, where you need to focus on every little thing. My brain was just about reaching its absolute limits. Even the AI was telling me I was starting to enter a danger zone. As I was laying there, I could actually feel one of the medics come in and give me an IV just to keep me functional. The AI must have sent that, because I sure as hell didn't call him. And as the battle finally ended in this sector, I scanned all the others to see what had happened. There was still one planet, just one, where fighting was still taking place. Reason being is that planet had been taken. It was far on the other side of Chitter territory, but it had been taken early, and the enemy was very well dug in. So much so that some people were thinking about orbital bombardment just to get them out. But we don't do that because we want the planet. We offered them to surrender, we as in humanity. We said that they could return in their shuttles. We would get them close enough to just drop them off in their own home sectors as a sign of goodwill and looking for future peace. At least, that's what we tell them. At this point, I didn't need any more fighting. We had lost too many already. But our lines had held, and that was the important part. With that last planet, I could see that several of the battle groups, human battle groups, along with those of Chitters, were heading towards there, and they were loaded for bear with all sorts of drop soldiers. And when they hit the ground, especially in the new upgraded heavy exosuits, God help them, because no ordnance punches through that. You don't move nearly as fast as you'd like to, but you still have your dexterity. They're just very, very heavy, and heavy duty, especially with the built-in cannons and missile launchers and all sorts of funky shit. Maybe I should order one of those, the schematics for that myself, so I can make a few of my own, see how they operate. Maybe give it a few tweaks. All in all, the battle was not fun. This ship needs repairs, but the drones would have to do just patchwork for right now. I would need a large fabricator to replace the large sections so that it could look new again. Then again, some people say that the damage gives it character. I say the damage gives it a hole. Several. So they can kiss the darkest part of my ass on that one. As we finished up, we realized that the aftermath of this battle would be something that echoes through the stars far beyond anything we could have imagined. But that is for another time.